A peeps, welcome back, and we are going to be starting our Unit 2 notes today. So you are going to be taking notes on the biology of behavior. So we'll talk about the brain in this unit, we're going to talk about the nervous system and the endocrine system, and as you know, yesterday we started talking about neurons. So you should have already drawn a neuron with me, so we're going to take time in a second and go back to that. But first, let me give you a couple of quick things about the neuron. So when we talk about the neuron, a neuron is just basically a nerve cell. So it's the basic building blocks of the nervous system, and it's kind of the go-between. So this is how your body and brain communicate through something called neural communication. So these cells are responsible for communicating throughout your body, and they do it lightning quick. So we're going to learn the structure of the neuron you learned yesterday. We'll review a little bit of that. And today we're going to talk about how they actually communicate. What does that look like? What does that entail? All right, so I actually want you to go ahead and take a few minutes, go back, pause this video, go back to your drawing from yesterday, and in your guided notes in your digital notebook, go ahead and label the neuron in your digital notebook based on our drawing from yesterday. So I'll give you a few minutes. Go ahead and pause the video and go do that. Okay, we're back. So there are billions of neurons in your brain, and all of these neurons are interconnected and constantly communicating throughout your body. So what we're going to learn today is the very basic level of neural communication, but just know that what we're learning is the basic side, but it's actually pretty complicated. Okay, so remember, one thing I want you to remember throughout this unit is that your brain is amazing and so complex that we still have so much to learn about it. Even now, there are things that are still untouched within understanding how the human brain works. So, but let's keep it simple, right? Let's start with the basics, okay? So, first of all, there are 3 phases of communication within a neuron. So, I'm going to go through each one of these with you. The first phase that I want you to know is called the action potential. The action potential is when the neural impulse that is created within a neuron fires. So think about a cannon, right? When a cannon is lit and it fires, it's one and done. It's all or nothing, right? Or another way that some people in psychology talk about this is a toilet flushing, right? You can't halfway flush a toilet. You either flush it or you don't. So it's all or nothing. All right, so the action potential is when the impulse, the neural impulse, travels from the dendrites down the axon to the terminal branches. The next phase in neural communication is called the refractory period. So if we use our cannon example, this is when the people firing the cannon have to reload. All right, so they're between, blasts, and they have to reload. So this is the brief instant when we have a new action potential, but it cannot be generated because the neuron needs to recharge first. Okay, so after the neuron has fired off its impulse, then it has to sort of regain its energy, so to speak. If you think of someone who just finished running a marathon, right? They can't immediately go run another marathon, right? They've got to recover, they've got to rest, and they've got to get their energy back, and then they can go do more. So this is what the refractory period is like. And one way you might think of this is you're refraining, right? If you refrain from doing something, you're not doing it yet, okay? You're holding back. So the neuron is waiting, it's recharging, and it's getting ready for the next action potential. And then the third phase to know about neural communication is called resting potential. So the resting potential stage is when the neuron is charged. It's ready to go, it's loaded, locked and loaded, right? It's ready to go, but it's waiting for the action potential to be generated to fire it. So if we go back to our cannon example, okay, the cannon is loaded, it's ready to go, the guy's got the lighter up to the fuse, but he's not lighting it yet. He's waiting for his commander to say fire. Okay, so the commander yelling fire, that's the action potential. Okay, so he's waiting for that, but he's ready to go any second that command comes. All right, and then when the command comes, boom, action potential. Okay, so these are 3 phases that every neuron goes through when it is firing its impulses to communicate with other neurons. So let's talk about what this looks like when you have multiple neurons and they are communicating with each other. So you have action potentials that travel from one neuron to another across a tiny gap between neurons called the synapse. Okay, now the synapse isn't just empty space. It's full of liquid and chemicals, but it's that space between neurons. So neurons never actually touch. Now, let's just think of 2 neurons, because we know it can get complicated. One neural chain could have hundreds, thousands, millions, billions of neurons connected all in one chain. But let's just take 2. So the sending neuron, so let's say this is our sending neuron, okay, right here. The sending neuron is what we would call the presynaptic neuron. So presynaptic, meaning it comes before the synapse, right? It's the one sending information across that coming synapse, so across that space. So the sending neuron is the presynaptic neuron. It is the neuron that's transmitting the message or the information. Then you have your receiving neuron on the other side, and it would go on this way. Okay, so the receiving neuron is also called the postsynaptic neuron, meaning it's after the synapse. So it's the one receiving the information from its buddy. Okay, and one thing to point out is that when you have an action potential, it is going to travel the same direction across a neuron every time. It will always go this direction. And when I say this direction, I mean it will go from the dendrites down the axon to the terminal branches. And then the postsynaptic neuron, the receiving neuron, will receive that information into its dendrites, and when it has its action potential and the action potential fires, then the information will go down the second neuron's axon to the terminal branches, and so on. It will always go in that order. So when an action potential reaches an axon terminal, it stimulates the release of neurotransmitters, neurotransmitter molecules to be specific. So this right here is a zoomed in picture of a bulb or terminal button. There are a lot of names for this. Okay, so this big thing is the terminal button, and then within that are the vesicles, these larger circles, and then within the vesicle are your neurotransmitter molecules. So when the action potential reaches the terminal, it's going to release these neurotransmitters into the synapse. And these molecules will cross the synapse, or sometimes called the synaptic gap, and they will bind to the receptor sites on the receiving neuron. So this is our postsynaptic neuron over here. And the neurotransmitter molecules are either going to excite or inhibit a new action potential in the receiving neuron. Now, what do we mean by that? If you're excited, it means you're fired up, right? So it's either going to fire up another action potential, or if you inhibit, you're holding it back. So it's going to hold back another action potential from happening. So the sending neuron will normally reabsorb any excess neurotransmitter molecules that are still in the synaptic gap. And this is a process that we call reuptake. So reuptake, that makes perfect sense, right? You're taking it back up. You're retaking it up into the sending neuron or the presynaptic neuron. So now let's talk about what happens with these neurotransmitters. We'll talk about some of the specific neurotransmitters that you need to know and how each of these interact, and then how do other chemicals sometimes interact like neurotransmitters. But first, here's a cheesy joke, because I know you guys love my cheesy jokes. What did one neuron say to the other? Excited to meet you. Okay, so now let's talk about these receptor sites. Okay, so we're going to pretend that we're zoomed way, way, way in, and here's a receptor site on a receiving neuron. Okay, and if you notice, they're shaped certain ways, right? So we've got certain shapes here. And this blue shape here fits perfectly into the puzzle piece of our receptor site. That means that it is specific to that receptor site. So each neurotransmitter molecule will fit perfectly into its matching receptor site. So then what happens if, say, we have a neurotransmitter like acetylcholine? Okay, acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that has to do with the function of movement and a little bit with memory. So the neurotransmitter, when acetylcholine, which is sometimes called ACH, when that is released, then it can affect our movement and sometimes our memory, etc. So now let's talk about what happens if you get some kind of drug in the body. How does that affect neurotransmitter chemicals? So let's talk for a second, actually. Let me backtrack. Neurotransmitters are bodily chemicals that are natural to your body. So they're supposed to be there. And this is what we would call endogenous chemicals. It means that it is created within your body, your natural biochemistry. It belongs there. So then what about chemicals that come into your body from the outside, like drugs? Okay, so for example, let's take the drug curare. Okay, the drug curare is not natural to your body. So we would call this an exogenous chemical. So what happens if the drug curare enters our body? How is that going to affect us? Well, curare is what we would call an antagonist. What does that mean? That means that it blocks the neurotransmitter. So curare is an acetylcholine antagonist. So what happens then if you put curare into the body's system? If it's an acetylcholine antagonist, that means it's going to inhibit the functions that acetylcholine promotes. So acetylcholine, remember, it affects our movement. If we introduce curare, which is an acetylcholine antagonist, and it blocks that function, what's going to happen to our body? So if you guessed that introducing curare, which is an acetylcholine antagonist, into the body would paralyze someone, you were correct. It is going to inhibit movement, which means that it will prevent the person from being able to move. So this is what an antagonist does. It blocks the neurotransmitter receptor sites and prevents the neurotransmitter from being used. So then let's talk about a different type of exogenous chemical. What about black widow venom? So if someone's bitten by a black widow, what happens in their body with this type of chemical? Black widow venom would be considered an acetylcholine agonist. Okay, so this is different from an antagonist, and you can guess it's going to do the opposite of what an antagonist does. An antagonist blocks neurotransmitter function, but an agonist mimics the neurotransmitter. If you notice, this is our black widow venom chemical, and it fits pretty closely, almost the same, into this receptor site as acetylcholine. So what does that do to your brain? It convinces your brain that it is acetylcholine. And so what this tells your body is that it tricks the body into thinking that you are being flooded with acetylcholine. So then your brain is going to produce less acetylcholine because it thinks I've got plenty, I don't need any more. And the problem with that is that it is going to cause an overexcitation of movement. So can you guess what that would look like on the outside if someone is having this happen inside of their body? If you guessed that that would look like a seizure, you were correct. So an agonist mimics the neurotransmitter. It makes the body think that it has far too much of it or more than it needs, and it is going to act almost as if the original neurotransmitter is overactive. Okay, now let's talk about another type of neurotransmitter that you need to know, and this is called endorphins. Endorphins reduce pain. Let's talk about an exogenous chemical that relates to endorphins. This is called morphine. So notice that the words endorphin and morphine have some similarity, right? They sound kind of similar. And here's why. Endorphins reduce pain. And so does morphine, right? We know that morphine is used in hospitals, right, as a way to relieve pain in patients. So endorphins are the neurotransmitter that naturally is produced by your body to reduce pain, and morphine is an exogenous chemical that comes into the body from the outside to do the same thing. So here's how I remember that. Remember we talked about how the chemicals that are natural to your body are your endogenous chemicals, and the chemicals that are not natural to your body are exogenous. So morphine reduces pain, and endorphins are endogenous, right? Endogenous morphine, right? So endogenous morphine is the body chemical that is natural to your body, the neurotransmitter that naturally reduces pain. Okay, so if morphine mimics endorphins, then what kind of exogenous chemical is it? We would call morphine an endorphin agonist because it mimics what the function of endorphins are. All right, now let's talk about GABA. GABA is a neurotransmitter, and it stands for gamma aminobutyric acid. Do you need to know that? You probably want to at least have an idea of that in your head, but we're going to call it GABA because that's a mouthful. Okay, so GABA is a neurotransmitter that helps to control anxiety. So that's the endogenous chemical in your body to reduce anxiety. Now, one thing that people will use to reduce their anxiety is alcohol. Obviously, alcohol is an exogenous chemical, so it is not natural to your body. And alcohol also mimics the function of GABA. So if alcohol mimics GABA, it is what? An agonist or an antagonist? If you said agonist, you are correct. Our next major neurotransmitter is called dopamine. Dopamine serves to control your brain's reward and pleasure center. So some psychologists like to joke that it is one of the few things that actually makes you happy. So dopamine controls your reward and pleasure centers, is associated with some common disorders and diseases that affect a lot of people in very major ways. So for example, a lack of dopamine is associated with Parkinson's disease. Many patients that are diagnosed with Parkinson's are given treatment by being given a drug called L-Dopa. L-Dopa is a dopamine agonist. So that means that it mimics the function of dopamine. So for a Parkinson's patient who is lacking in that dopamine functioning, they need more of that, and so they are prescribed L-Dopa, which convinces the brain that it is getting dopamine. Now, on the flip side of that, if someone has too much dopamine, an excess of dopamine, this is associated with schizophrenia. So schizophrenia patients are often treated with a drug called thorazine. Thorazine is a dopamine antagonist. So thorazine blocks the function of dopamine. So when someone has too much, it will block and reduce the amount of dopamine function in the brain and helps them balance back out. So I hope that you're seeing that there is this balancing act with all these chemicals in your body. So this is why some people struggle with different mental disorders or different things like depression, anxiety, Parkinson's disease, schizophrenia, etc. And we'll learn more about all of those later. But this is the biology behind that. So it's not something that, depression isn't always circumstantial. This is why some people who struggle with depression, they can't explain why they feel the way that they feel, why they're experiencing depression. They don't necessarily have a reason that something terrible happened to them or they're going through a difficult experience. Sometimes it's because their brain chemistry is out of balance, and so it's a biological problem and not necessarily something that has to do with their circumstances or their emotional health. Another major neurotransmitter that you need to know is called serotonin. Serotonin, like dopamine, is something that promotes mood. It helps regulate mood. So the joke that I mentioned on the last slide is that dopamine and serotonin are the only two things that really make you happy. So a lack of serotonin leads to depression. And many people who experience this lack of serotonin are prescribed drugs like Prozac. Now, Prozac is not an agonist or an antagonist for serotonin. And you might wonder, well, then how does it work? How does it help? So what Prozac or other drugs that are prescribed for depression tend to do is they are called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. So think back to a few slides ago when I explained the reuptake process. After an action potential has released chemicals into the synapse, there are sometimes extra molecules that are in the synapse after the receiving neuron has taken that information. So those extra molecules are hanging out in the brain. And what happens is if they get taken back up in the reuptake process, but there aren't enough in the brain to help regulate mood, then we see someone experience depression. So what Prozac does is it blocks this end, it blocks that sending neuron from reabsorbing the serotonin that is in the synapse after the action potential. So it allows that serotonin to hang out in the synapse where it can be used to regulate a person's mood. So Prozac does not mimic and it does not block like the other chemicals we've talked about. It doesn't block the receiving neuron, it blocks the sending neuron after it has released that chemical from reabsorbing it. Now let's talk about how this looks, okay? What's the full chain of events in neural communication? So this is what we would call a neural chain or a reflex arc. So I want you to imagine a time that maybe you hurt your hand, you touch something hot, right? So let's say someone touches the flame of a candle. So the process starts with their skin receptors. Their skin receptors detect the heat from the flame and they generate a nerve impulse in the nerves in their hand. So that is what we call sensory information. It's information that deals with your senses. And it's the incoming information from outside the body to the body. So your sensory nerves carry the information to the spinal cord. All right, so they're going to carry that from your hand and through the sensory nerves all the way to the spinal cord. Then the spinal cord sends that information up to the brain through interneurons. Interneurons are in the brain and the spinal cord, and they are going to process the sensory information that came in from outside. Next, a motor neuron, which deals with outgoing information, will carry the command from the brain to, hey, withdraw your finger from that flame. Ow, that hurts, right? So it's going to take the command to withdraw the finger back to the hand, and that is what makes you pull your hand away from the flame. And remember, all that happens lightning fast. So your muscles, your finger muscles will contract to pull your finger from the flame. And one thing I want to point out here as far as terminology is that you might hear sensory neurons called afferent neurons, and you might hear your motor neurons called efferent neurons. So there's an easy acronym for this, and it's called SAME, S-A-M-E. So think sensory afferent, motor efferent.